Good evening. Welcome to this very special edition of Ozarks Tonight. I'm Brian Calfano, and joined by two of our brand new Ozarks First contributors, Amy Blancett and Nick Reed, both of whom have been on our air before and have been with me for our podcast called From the Constituency that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. But one of the big reasons to have you both on at the same time is to try out a new format and talk a little bit about how we have, as adults, political discussions and deal with some controversial issues. And so I thought we might as well start off with something nice and easy, like abortion.
Very easy.
And here we are talking about what is sort of the topic that a lot of people, they hear about it in the news and they don't really want to bring that topic up maybe at dinner or when they're talking with friends or whatever it happens to be. Let's just put this out here and say the idea for this segment is to try to model a conversation where people who disagree can still, at the end, find maybe some insight in the other person's point of view. And so let's just throw this out there then. Your views on this brand new bill that was signed into law by Governor Mike Parson that restricts abortion access after the 8th week of pregnancy. We'll start with Nick.
All right. Well, just, so people can take it with a grain of salt, I'm pretty pro-life, about probably as pro-life as a person can get. So you can take that into consideration. I think that it is a good starting point for legislation. I think that it's an area that the pro-life movement hasn't had a lot of success with in terms of is it a life or isn't a life. That's always been a real big discussion point. And generally, pro-life people, hence the name pro-life, it's because they see it as a life. And I remember growing up and before, science is constantly advancing. And so there was always that question, well, when does life begin? When does life begin? And at some point, that marker of a heartbeat, people who aren't even medical, like myself, we associate a heartbeat with life. We just, that's just something we do outside of the context of abortion. Whenever somebody is pronounced dead, it's a heartbeat, Whenever you call 911 and there's somebody on the floor, check, do they have a pulse? And I think that marker, if you will, when it comes to where is that line drawn, that's more effective than anything that the pro-life movement has done in terms of legislation. Because we hear first trimester, second, and third, that doesn't really mean as much as heartbeat.
But what about the idea of restricting a woman's access to a procedure entirely, which is essentially what this has done? Because you've got one abortion clinic hanging by a thread in St. Louis. 8 weeks. I've never had a kid, but people who have tell me that's not a lot of time to make a decision. Amy.
So that is the bigger thing, is looking at the time. Previously, we had 20 or 24 weeks, so a female really does understand that she's first pregnant and then has a period of time to make a really educated choice about what does it mean for her, what does it mean for her family, what are these long-term consequences, if we can talk about a life being a consequence, which, is a very, difficult struggle for some people to think that way. But really to find out that you are pregnant and then to have any time to process and now be told that you have a very short term to make a very big decision, it means that people are going to make a decision in haste, and they may make a decision that they don't want to make, but they know that if they don't make it immediately, now all of a sudden the choice that I might have had or a choice I might have made differently had I had more time to think about it. So I think there's sometimes we don't think about all the things that a new rule or a new law makes. It's always like, okay, can we create a line that means people can't really make the choice in general, but we forget that means sometimes they might make a choice that you wish that they hadn't made in that very short period of time in that first 8 weeks.
Now, just to jump in here again, what about the whole pro-life idea, Nick? This is a state with high maternal mortality rates, poverty, all kinds of trouble for kids growing up. I think I know where you're going to come out on this, though, but I'll let you say it. If the state's not investing in a lot of programs to help kids, is that really pro-life, or is the movement with a lot of conservatives behind it more like what they say is pro-birth?
Well, I think this is the different approach, and you can hear, as she's talking about long-term consequences, which are a reality, particularly for a mother. Generally, the approach for pro-life is ultimately we are talking about a life, and so that takes precedent over any sort of economic consequences, any sort of uncomfortable factors that are there. Not that they aren't important factors. And so for somebody who has a very pro-life approach like myself, that is a very important and different conversation, but it's not one that has an impact on the position of whether or not that life has the right to be born. So if you approach somebody like me who's pro-life and you start talking economics, I'm thinking, how do you put a value, dollar value? At what point do you say, well, if their economic status is going to be in the bottom 20%, they don't deserve to live? Because that's how I hear it, because to me that's a life. And so those are very, very important issues. But when it comes to whether or not abortion should be legal given those circumstances, it's two totally different conversations, if that makes sense.
Speaking of two conversations, we're going to pick up with Amy's response when we come right back. Back to our Ozarks Tonight, talking about abortion with our two Ozarks First contributors. And Amy, you wanted to respond to Nick's point about it's not economics. Don't even bring any of that up. It's about the life and making sure that that human developing child, whatever you want to say, is protected.
And I agree with you. It is very difficult to say that these should they be two different conversations? But really, when the work that I'm doing and seeing families that are struggling, I would hate to say that just because my family is low income means that they shouldn't have been born. And that's not the argument. But really, instead, looking at if a woman who is in a difficult situation and knows what it's like, knows that it's only going to get worse, and knows that the individuals who are making this law are not going to support her. As you said, Missouri has some of the lowest social support systems, yet we have some of these most stringent laws saying, well, a child must be born. And if that child must be born, then whose responsibility? If you made the law saying that I must have the baby, I'm also asking, will you also help me support? If I don't have a choice, and I know that the epigenetics and the future of this child, ACE scores that we can talk about as well, the adverse childhood experiences, it's really difficult to say that you're going to force me to put a child in that situation when I live it and I know how difficult it is, and I don't want to do that to a baby, a child, an adult. Where's my choice if you're not going to help me support after it? So I agree with you. Is it the question of pro-life, or is it really the question of pro-birth? And in our state, a lot of people through their votes show that it's really, yes, we believe in the birth, but we're not willing to support what that means financially for our state.
And that is always the comeback against the so-called pro-life positioning. I know you have, it's like philosophical, it's like the life is the life. But don't folks see that there might be like an inconsistency there? Like, we got to do something from a societal standpoint, even if we're not talking about ideological.
Sure, yeah, and I think a lot of that also is the perspective on whose role is it to do that. I happen to believe the least effective way to successfully help people is using government to do so, largely because it's impersonal, it's very bureaucratic, it takes forever to get anything done. And also the recipient of help, I find that there tends to just be a difference in the receiving of it if it's like a person who's voluntarily doing it or an organization. To me, the most effective charity or help is a person volunteering their time or help to someone, then an organization. Government's last. So when it comes to helping people, which I love, I'm always like, don't go into government. A pregnancy care center or just one-on-one or through churches, because to me it's human to human. It's so much more meaningful. And so I would suggest that simply because maybe government isn't the answer for some people, that doesn't mean that they are opposed to helping. It's just oftentimes they have a different way of doing it.
But the helping comes more from more money for schools. It's not necessarily the development of the unborn child for those 9 months. It is, what are you going to do? You're going to have a bad neighborhood they're going to be brought up in, crime. They're going to have an outlook that's going to be stressful. As children, it's going to set them off to not have a very productive life potentially. Again, I see the point. It's not why you should have an abortion, but what about all of these other structural things going on?
Well, and again, and I'll quickly so you can you can counter. But so I'm very big in the belief that government doesn't generally fix problems. that oftentimes they compound them and make them worse. So it isn't, when you talk about schools and neighborhoods, yes, these are areas that as a culture, as a society, we see them and we see the problems and how we need to fix those. But the conversation then becomes, well, okay, how is best to do that? And I'm one who believes that government isn't the most effective way to do it. So if I have the stance, well, we shouldn't fund this or we shouldn't fund that through government, it's not because I think, well, we don't care. It's just I believe there's a more effective way to do it.
Well, I agree, and there's kind of two parts. One of them is you said that you don't believe that government is the best way to implement certain programs, yet here we have government implementing a choice. And so, like, we like to pick when we want a lot of government control, and typically it's when our views are being challenged. And then we say, but I don't want government control in this area of my life. And so to say that I'm okay for government to choose when life is life, but I'm not okay for government to come in and be a part of the process afterwards is also an interesting argument that we hear back and forth. I want government when it's convenient for me to make these decisions. The second part is I wholeheartedly agree with you. We get systems put into place by lawyers and lawmakers and kind of this behind the scenes that goes into drafting a law who don't often have to live by the law. And so we have a lot of policy for individuals who are in lower income and battling with a lot of these decisions, who are having to live in a system that does not work. So I do agree with you there on the idea that government in many of these areas is not the best place to tell me how to do it, when to do it. It should come from moral, community, and culture. And that's one of the things that as we're seeing the rate of abortions decrease, we're really looking at, well, was it because of a law? Well, no, because most states really, they're in that 20 to 24 weeks. Most of us agree after that, you know, the child is viable and it is a child. But we're seeing culturally that individuals are choosing to have less children. And so what if we spent more time talking about a culture that promoted talking about sexuality and, more importantly, talking about birth control? You know, we haven't really gone or talked enough about upstream.
Yeah, we're almost out of time. So
well, I just want to quickly, because I think it's an important point from my perspective, the distinction between government involvement when it comes to abortion and all these other programs, because that's a great, valid point to bring up. Well, why government here and not there? I feel one of the very few but basic roles of government is to protect all human life, whatever form that is, and to acknowledge that no human has domain over another. And so if there is a point in which government does, you know, intervene, it is to protect individuals. It's why we have child abuse laws and others, because government has a role in that. And so that's a distinction for me in terms of a difference of government intervening in that capacity versus programs and so forth.
there's so much to talk about here.
We should just we could just have our own show.
We could, yeah.
In fact, we do. It's called From the Constituency. It's a podcast available on ozarksfirst.com. Both Nick and Amy will be regular contributors to it, and we'll continue this conversation there, and we're going to have them back very soon. But thanks to both of you, and that wasn't so bad, right?
Yeah, it's good. I still like you.
I like you too.
Yeah.
Oh,
We'll all
we
go
must
out
have
to
done it
dinner.
either right or we did it wrong. I don't know which way.
We'll be back after this.